Hello, this is Pro Life Indeed, and I wanted to talk to you today about kind of Americans' spending and how that could potentially be used to save quite a few lives from abortion. Um, so, kind of one of the big things that people throw around is that it's a tough economy, that they don't have money to spend on things. And that's not really true, at least in the case of Americans. If we're talking about like Ethiopia, for example, like, yeah, I kind of get that. But for Americans, it's not quite as true. The average American spends about $3,500 a year on entertainment, something that's not really needed for your life at all. Um, and the average American makes, I think it's typically between $30,000 to $40,000. Um, some people make more than $40,000, of course. But that kind of gives you a baseline. People spend roughly 10% or a little less of their income on entertainment. So people could be contributing quite a bit more to pro life causes if they wanted to. And I imagine it varies widely among pro life people. Some people contributing a lot, and others not so much, or none at all, even. Um, but that's a major thing to consider is like people do spend quite a bit of money on entertainment. So they can afford things. It's just they're not really choosing the right things from the pro life perspective. Think of like how much is a human life worth? A human life is obviously worth the entertainment of quite a few people. I would prioritize human life well above entertainment, even if it was entertainment for a lot of people. So that's something to consider. Is like we do have more resources than we give ourselves credit for sometimes. Even though pro-lifers generally aren't all that wealthy in comparison to pro-choicers, there is still a trend in which people do use their money in pretty frivolous ways. They like spending money on fun things. They like having a good time, and while that's understandable, it's not necessarily the right choice. Save Unborn Life is one charity that I like because it's a very efficient and calculable impact. Where some charities you're not really sure what is done with the money or how they use it and if it's used efficiently. Um, Save Unborn Life is a pretty direct one where they offer a contract to women saying, well, if you're considering abortion for financial reasons, we'll provide financial assistance. You will sign a contract saying, okay, if you just give birth to the baby, if you allow the baby to be born, then we will contribute $3,000 to you to be used as you see fit, and they can use that for paying their rent if they have bills to pay. If they have utilities, if they need to buy baby food, clothes, a crib, basic essentials like that. It does cost money to take care of a child, and sometimes pro-lifers can be a little bit unsympathetic to that. Partly because some people have not raised kids themselves, or because they've had relatively stable finances. But there are some women who are in very difficult financial positions, and just a little bit of assistance can be enough to change her mind and allow her to spare the life of her own child. So, fortunately, it doesn't actually take that much most of the time to convince a woman to spare her own child's life. And fortunately, that's something that gives us a lot of power, because we have, the average person spending more than $3,000 a year on entertainment means we can set up a $3,000 contract for basically just the cost of entertainment. A year's worth of entertainment is all it takes basically to save a human life. So I think that's pretty important and pretty significant. Something that pro-lifers should know and consider whenever they're opening up their wallets to pay for something entertainment related. Like they should be considering to themselves, well, is this really the best use of my money? Could I be using it a little better? And I think the answer is normally yes. Um, and then another aspect of it, when it comes down to like financial struggle, it's something that it's kind of funny. Dave Smith, if you're not aware, he's a comedian who's been working for quite a long time. But it was I believe before the 2008 elections, there were a lot of debates on healthcare and reform, and some of those things were preceding Obamacare, or I think they called it the Affordable Care Act was the technical name. Um, but there were occasionally like reporters, like when they were setting up debates between politicians or aspiring politicians, they would tell them, well, these are some of the basic facts and background information. And one of the facts they mentioned was that a large portion of American medical spending was due to obesity and people just overeating and not exercising. Um, so they pointed out those things, and Dave Smith, he recounted this I think in a podcast not too long ago. But he was thinking back to this when he saw that on TV. He's like, hold on, how is that not like the main focal point here? Like obesity causing most of our medical spending, like as in we could cut our medical spending in half if we were to get rid of obesity. He was like astounded at that, and that's something that stuck with him, and he referenced it years later. But yeah, he's someone who I respect. He's given a lot of talks, especially when it comes down to war policy. that I think are pretty reasonable, and trying to avoid nuclear war and all that. Um, but yeah, he's someone I respect. But yeah, he talked about this where Americans actually do have a lot of money to spend, and part of that's like we have money to spend on food, and then we eat so much food that we need to spend more money on medicine. So it's pretty ridiculous because it seems like in a certain sense like um, our gluttony, and our, we make so much money that it's easy to get fat, and then it's easy to get fat, so it's easy to have those medical problems resulting from obesity, which costs us even more in medicine. And ironically, the people with lower income in the United States tend to be of higher BMI. They tend to be fatter basically as they get poorer. Implying that Americans, for the most part, aren't doing so badly. And, food is one of the cheaper pleasures in life, which I think explains why people who can't afford some of the more expensive pleasures eat a lot. So I think that's part of it. But when you eat, that's something within your control. Like nothing forces you to eat more Doritos or something like that. You can just eat less. Like there's no actual consequence to that other than just being slightly less happy when clearing off a plate. Like so that's one where people have a lot of control over that. And with like the upper limits of obesity, like when you get up to like class 3 obesity, that's increasing medical expenditures by like 200%. So you're tripling your medical expenses if you're like in like the upper limits of obesity. That gets really bad for you. And we've heard stories of, I mean, most people have heard stories of people having to get hip replacements, knee replacements, um, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. Like there are a lot of negative consequences of obesity that most likely could be avoided if we just weren't eating so much. And unfortunately, that's something that we need to think about and reflect on pretty regularly. When we're looking at ourselves in the mirror, like, should I be this fat? Should I be skinnier? Like that is something for us to consider. And I think that's something that even I can think about a bit too. Whereas I'm not exactly an athlete to where I could definitely be skinnier than I am now. So that's something that all of us need to consider. It's like the money we're spending on food. In addition to spending more on food, we're also setting ourselves up to pay more for medical expenses. And even with all those medical expenses, we're still probably going to live a shorter lifespan than someone who is skinnier. Um, Although, you don't want to be too skinny. There are some people who are really skinny, and those people actually have very short mortalities, even more short than fat people. So that is something to consider. Like you don't want to go too far with it because that is a problem on its own. But for the most part, we have control over ourselves, and we can just exercise moderation when it comes down to eating. And that's something that, as pro-lifers, we need to be considering. Obviously, we have an obligation to take care of others, but more fundamentally, we also have an obligation to take care of ourselves, to be good caretakers of the temple that is our own bodies. So that's an important thing to consider too. But yeah, like when people say we don't have enough money to donate, or we're struggling financially, like take that with a grain of salt, because most Americans are spending $3,000 a year on entertainment, and then they're also overeating, and then that's costing them more in medicine. So even though medicine sounds like a non-discretionary expense, as in something you can't just get rid of, it kind of is something you can get rid of, because you can cut the cost in half if you go from being moderately or even severely obese down to being a healthy weight. Like that really does reduce your medical expenditures on average. So that's something that you do have to take with a grain of salt when people complain about inflation or the economy in general. Like, have a little bit of skepticism for those claims, because there are a lot of wasted expenses, a lot of things that don't really need to be expenses. And I think that's a good thing to think about, considering how we use our money and then what our decision making is that potentially could help us save quite a few more lives from abortion. Because we have these economic tools to save lives, and I think we should be making full use of them. So hopefully I give you some good food for thought. Thank you so much, and have a great day.